Justin Thomas said one sentence about LIV golf in July of 2022, and the golf world has been trying to punish him for it ever since. His world ranking collapsed. He missed a Ryder Cup. Reporters called him bitter, sanctimonious, obsessed. He was told he had let LIV occupy too much of his mind. 4 years later, the league he warned about is dead. The Saudis pulled their $5 billion. The players who took the money are now negotiating the terms of their return. And the one player who said the quiet part out loud, who refused to soften when everyone else softened, has been quietly erased from the story of being right. This is what he said, what it cost him, and why the golf world owes him an apology it will probably never give. To understand why Thomas saw what he saw, you have to understand who Thomas is. His father, Mike Thomas, is a PGA professional in Kentucky. Justin grew up on a driving range. He won the FedEx Cup at 24. He won the PGA Championship in 2017, and again in 2022. He came up alongside Jordan Spieth and Ricky Fowler in a generation of American players who had been told their entire lives that the PGA Tour was the meritocracy that mattered. When LIV launched and started writing 9-figure checks to players he had competed against for years, Thomas did not process it as a business story. He processed it as a question of honesty. He explained on the same podcast appearance, "It's tough. And I never thought I would be laying in bed so many nights thinking about freaking tour and what's going on and all this stuff." That is not the language of a man pursuing a media strategy. That is the language of a player who genuinely could not stop thinking about it. The early Thomas position was not complicated, and he never made it complicated. Players were entitled to make their own decisions. He understood that. What bothered him was the unwillingness to admit what those decisions actually were. Phil Mickelson had given the famous quote about Saudi Arabia's leadership being scary people, and yet still being a way to gain leverage over the PGA Tour. Dustin Johnson had given a brief statement about wanting more time with his family. Sergio Garcia had complained about the PGA Tour's culture. None of them had simply said the obvious. Thomas wanted them to. He felt the entire conversation was being conducted in bad faith, and he refused to participate in that bad faith. He named the thing. By March of 2023, the PGA Tour had announced its first wave of changes, designed to compete with LIV. Limited fields, increased purses, no cuts at certain events. The format of the PGA Tour had started to look more like the format of the league Thomas had been criticizing for 9 months. At the Players' Championship press conference, a reporter asked him directly what now distinguished the PGA Tour from LIV, given how much had been copied. Thomas did not hesitate. "Well, we have an astronomically higher amount of quality players than they do in their events. I think all of us have not been shy to say it that this is stuff that we've been trying to do, and have worked on. Obviously got sped up a crazy amount due to what was going on in the outside. The line landed exactly the way it was meant to." Thomas had positioned himself, alongside Rory McIlroy, as the most reliable on-record critic of LIV from inside the locker room. And then the price arrived. What followed for Thomas was the worst stretch of golf he had played in over 6 years. After finishing the 2022 season with 5 consecutive poor results, he carried that form into 2023, and could not shake it. Missed cuts piled up. His world ranking slid. He failed to make the Ryder Cup team that fall, and watched it from outside the ropes. The narrative inside golf media was not subtle. Thomas had let LIV occupy his mind. He had become the spokesperson, when he should have been a competitor. The opinion pieces wrote themselves, live by the soundbite, die by the soundbite. The implication was that his game had collapsed because his focus had collapsed, and his focus had collapsed because he could not stop talking about a tour he claimed to not respect. Some of that may even have been true. None of it changed whether he was right. In early 2024, Netflix released the 2nd season of Full Swing, and Thomas finally addressed the personal cost of the division on camera. "The relationship between tour guys and LIV guys is weird," he said. "It has got a little chippier and chippier. There are plenty of guys that have gone to that tour that I didn't talk to before, and I still have no desire to talk to." It was a quieter line than the 2022 podcast quote, but it described something more important. The fracture was no longer an argument about money or schedules or ethics. It had become a fracture between people. Friendships had ended. Locker room conversations had stopped. The sport had split, not just structurally but socially, and Thomas was acknowledging out loud what almost every player on tour was experiencing privately. The mockery he had absorbed for being too obsessed with LIV started to look in retrospect like an honest report from inside the room. Then came the framework agreement of June 2023, when the PGA Tour stunned its own players by announcing a deal in principle with the Saudi Public Investment Fund. For players who had publicly defended the tour against LIV, the betrayal was profound. Rory McIlroy, the most consequential of those defenders, eventually softened his stance and arrived at a different conclusion. By early 2025, McIlroy was saying that players had to get over it and move forward, that anyone still upset about LIV players returning was, in his words, butthurt. Thomas refused to follow him there. At the WM Phoenix Open in February of 2024, he was direct. I would have a hard time with it, and I think a lot of guys would have a hard time with it, and I'm sure we don't need to convince you why we would have a hard time with it. He acknowledged that some LIV players would make the tour better. He acknowledged that things were changing. But he insisted on one thing the tour leadership did not want to hear. There had to be consequences. Players who stayed had made sacrifices. Those sacrifices could not be retroactively erased by a settlement designed to make everyone whole. This was the position that made Thomas unfashionable in a way that even his earlier criticism had not. By 2024 and 2025, the political wind in golf was blowing toward reunification, toward letting the LIV players back with as little friction as possible. Thomas was the one player in the room willing to say in front of a microphone that loyalty had a price, and that the tour owed something to the players who had paid it. He was joined by Ricky Fowler, by Jordan Spieth, by a handful of others, but the public debate had moved on. Thomas was now arguing for a value, accountability, that the negotiators across the table had stopped finding useful. The 2026 returning member program proved him exactly right. When the PGA Tour finally opened its narrow door for LIV players to come back, the terms were closer to what Thomas had been demanding than what McIlroy had been offering: a $5 million charitable contribution. No equity in the Tour's player equity program for 5 years, worth somewhere between $50 and $85 million. No signature event eligibility, no FedEx Cup bonus money. The structure of the deal was an admission. The Tour had quietly acknowledged that players who stayed had made a sacrifice, that those who left had received a benefit, and that some form of penalty was required to balance the two. Brooks Koepka was the only one who walked through the door. Jon Rahm, Bryson DeChambeau, Cameron Smith all declined. Then Saudi Arabia pulled its funding, and the door closed behind them on terms that were no longer being designed in their favor. Thomas did not get a victory lap. By the time LIV's collapse became official in April of 2026, the broader narrative had moved on. His major drought was 4 years deep. Critics inside golf media still cited his on-course struggles as evidence that his off-course commentary had been a distraction. The same writers who had spent 2 years calling him bitter had no interest in revisiting whether bitter and correct were actually compatible. They have the balls to say it, quote, "The single sharpest line any active player produced during the entire LIV era had effectively been forgotten by the people now writing obituaries for the breakaway league." There is a version of this story where Thomas wins back-to-back majors in 2024 and is celebrated as the prophet of the LIV era. That version did not happen. The version that did happen is harder. He said the true thing early. He paid for saying it. He kept saying it after it stopped being fashionable. He watched his peers soften and refused to soften with them. And when the tour finally drew up the terms that proved he had been right all along, nobody bothered to credit him for the position he had held in public for 4 straight years. The thing about being right early is that nobody remembers you were early. They remember the people who were loud at the end. Justin Thomas was loud at the beginning, when it cost him something to be loud, and then he stayed exactly where he was while everyone else moved.